And I've had people ask me, why do you follow so-and-so? Because follows are also seen as a sign of support because you're adding followers and presumably in the algorithm raising prominence to a channel.
Yeah.
But I'm right there with you. I follow lots of accounts of people who I fundamentally disagree with, but I'm trying to learn. And I'm also trying to understand what their capture points are, like why people find them so intriguing.
Yes.
Anyway, I'm a learner. I'm a forager like you. So
I'm in the same boat. And every once in a while, I think like it's stunning to me. I don't know if you've ever looked at your Instagram statistics, but somebody, a colleague of mine actually showed me. I was like, I didn't even realize you could look at the effect of each post on follows and unfollows.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
And I think my typical ratio might be 2 or 3 to 1 for a post. So I'm gaining 2 or 3 followers to every one that I lose. The idea that I could post anything that would cause someone to unfollow me, like if I said something interesting enough that you thought I was worth following, how could one post change your mind about that? I think you're too focused on what I think and maybe not paying attention to how I think. Was my first reaction to that. And then my second thought was, well, maybe what's happening here is like people show up and they don't realize the foundation of evidence behind the total body of work. And so one post, strikes them wrong and they think this person is not credible, or they think that this person has, lost sight of what rigorous science is. I wonder if you've had that experience too of, like, I think I make the mistake of taking for granted that anybody who followed me knows that if I post something, I think it's worth thinking about and, it's been carefully studied. And I didn't have a dog in the fight. I read this research and said, this cleared the bar, not only of an academic journal, but I read the methods and I found them sound enough that we ought to be discussing this idea. Have you had that experience too?
I certainly have. And I should say that, I was weaned in an academic culture, 3 separate mentors, very different styles, all of whom were excellent mentors, but all of whom taught me that, there are phenomenal papers where every bit of information in the paper and indeed how it's written from start to finish is just watertight and incredible. And there are other papers that are less watertight, but occasionally there will be papers where one data point in a figure is intriguing enough to consider following that scent trail in your own work. Mm-hmm. Even if the rest of the paper is kind of one data point. Now, that doesn't mean taking one data point and casting it out to millions of people on social media as an actionable item is valid. That's certainly not what I'm saying. No. But what I do realize, and I'm realizing again now after what you just said, is that indeed people don't know the context in which what filters are we working with before we bring things forward. And I think that my belief is that if it's grounded firmly in the scientific method, that that's the best starting place. We were talking about that earlier. And I also understand that scientists differ tremendously in how they look at even the same data in the same paper. So there is no governing body that says, okay, this paper means blank. The authors have their interpretation. The students have their interpretation. In fact, the course I used to teach to undergraduates, which grew into a very large course, we would learn to ask 4 questions. What's the question that the authors were asking? Sometimes a sub-question. What methods did they use? What did they find? And then what did they conclude? And does it relate back to the original question? And that simple breaking out of 4 questions of studies is essentially what I do for all studies. But I have my way of doing it, and it's going to differ from the way that other people do it. Social media, I think what's interesting is that I think there's always going to be a core following of a given person, like your followers, that they're going to trust, not necessarily across the board, but there's a general acceptance of ideas coming through. I think that on social media, it's hard to strike a balance between setting the whole context and the actionable takeaways. I get criticized a lot for not being concise enough, and I agree. But I also get criticized for taking things out of context.
Yes.
So
it's such a tightrope walk.
It's a tightrope walk, and it's always going to be a tightrope walk. And so I'm going to just keep going, and I know you will too. And listen, there's some kids out there, it's surely not going to be one that are going to take our jobs eventually, and we'll find a way to do it much better. Who knows, through AI or something like that. Yeah. Might be robots. I feel like this is an appropriate place to ask about something else, since we're talking about sort of perception of of others and gleaning information, overcoming blind spots. It's something that you've written about some years ago now. I guess it would be almost 8 years ago now, about authenticity. The word authenticity is such a
minefield.
It's such a minefield. I was going to say has such a positive gravitational pull, like, oh, they're really authentic, as opposed to what's the opposite of authentic? Fake. Right? But I think we could all learn to draw some lines between authenticity and oversharing, right? How do we gauge authenticity? And we can refer people to that article you wrote some years ago. I think you may have written it differently to be written today. But you talked in that article about somebody who essentially decided to tell everyone that he worked with all the things that he was interested in doing with them, relating to them, and it did not serve him well. Okay, so that's authenticity.
Or them.
Right. And so then there's this this notion of benevolent deception in order to preserve relationship. And importantly, it brought about a word that we don't hear about very often, but that I rather like, which is etiquette. Like so for social media, by the way, I apply classroom rules. I'll tolerate any comment in the comment section, but not the sort of comment that I wouldn't tolerate in a classroom. If you start insulting other people, you can insult me, but if you want to insult other people, I'm not going to tolerate that. So that's where I draw the line, classroom rules. There's an etiquette. And I think that etiquette is important. So how do we balance authenticity with etiquette and also with preserving one's public life or private life, right? Authenticity at home seems important. You could be your complete self at home, except when you want to, physically hit your sister or brother because they ate your ice cream. That's not the right kind of authenticity.
No, it isn't. I think, I think it's such a rich and complicated topic. I think first thing is, I don't want people to be disingenuous, ever. But I have a real problem with people saying, as an excuse for disrespectful behavior, well, I was just being myself. I think David Sedaris said, yes, but yourself is an asshole.
So good. So good.
And I think what people forget is that we all have multiple selves, right? You've known this your whole career. We all have multiple identities. We also could think about yourself as your thoughts, your emotions, your values, your personality. So which facet of yourself are you trying to be true to? I would argue that authenticity without boundaries is careless. Authenticity without empathy is selfish. And part of being authentic is caring about other people's values. That should be one of your values. So what that means concretely is I don't think we should worry about being authentic to what we're thinking and feeling in any given moment. I think what we want to ask is what I'm about to do or say consistent with my principles. And sometimes that means you will be false to your personality in order to be true to your values. Sometimes that means you will feel like you're not honoring your thought or your emotion in the moment, but you're doing that with a broader view toward who is the person that I want to be. There was a cultural critic, Lionel Trilling, who wrote about the idea of sincerity as opposed to authenticity. And I really like this distinction. He said, when you try to think about being authentic, you're trying to bring the inside out. And to your point, Andrew, that's not always appropriate or effective. He said, sincerity is a little bit more about bringing the outside in. So pay attention to the person you claim to be, and then try to become that person. And that was a little bit of an aha moment for me. I realized, there are all these people who say, well, you should walk your talk. And I think that's good advice. I might even go a step further and say, maybe you should only talk it if you're already walking it. Maybe that would help us avoid hypocrisy. But I think the fundamental message here is that we all could be authentic to one part of ourselves and inauthentic to another part. And I think the most important part is to ask, what do I stand for? And if what I'm about to communicate is not consistent with that, then maybe I could self-censor.
Such great advice. And I suppose one has to wonder about the role of emotional states. I think there are career-ending mistakes that people make in a moment, especially online nowadays. And by the way, this is not just for people who are already established in their career. I've heard stories, and there seem to be more and more of these in the news, of of, for instance, videos of things that people said some years earlier, getting them ejected from college. A guest on Lex Friedman's podcast who works in the securities world said that one of the lessons that he teaches his kids is to not film themselves doing bad things, and of course also not to do bad things, but in general to just not film themselves doing anything because of his understanding of the risk of doing that. And we don't want to create a paranoia, but gosh, I mean, who you are when you're 14 is a very different person than who you are when you're 27 and when you're 50.
I hope so.
I hope so.
Otherwise you're not growing.
I think balancing authenticity across the lifespan, and we're expecting young minds to do this, and clearly older minds can't do it either. I mean, this is a pretty well-known case of a chair of a major psychiatry department. We won't name the university, but basically lost his job for a single tweet. He just was not being thoughtful. In fact, he was being really numb to other people and lost his job. And I think I don't know him, and it was obvious why he lost it. I don't think it was debatable, but gosh, you think about somebody who's a chair of psychiatry, which means they're a psychiatrist, which means they're trained to think about thinking, and there you go.
It's amazing how common this is. And I think one of the things that's fascinating to me is, I guess this goes back to something we were talking about a moment ago, but I think that when we communicate, we have access to the sum total of all of our thoughts and everything we've ever said that we can remember. And we forget that other people only have a snapshot. And so one of the questions I like to ask is, if this was the only post that somebody saw of mine, would I be proud of it? Would it communicate who I am and who I aspire to be?
Oh, that's so good.
If the answer is no, maybe I should pause before I put that out there.
That is excellent advice. If it were the only post, like your one and only, representing you. Oh, fantastic.
That could be paralyzing. So if you're a perfectionist, you'll never post. But I think for somebody who's posting regularly, it's a good filter to just ask, am I being thoughtful enough?
So good. I won't add anything to that. I'll just say so good. Let's talk about potential. I was in junior high school, and I remember having a social studies teacher who she just would go on and on about potential. She had a special program after school. You could get involved. Potential. And we hear about this. And, we have untapped potential. You hear we're only operating at 40% of our abilities. People will say that. The implication is that we have reservoirs of potential that we're just not accessing because we're not doing the right things, thinking the right things. I know you've now researched this topic extensively. You have a new book on this topic. Tell us about potential. Do we all have huge reservoirs of potential that we are not accessing? And of course, I and everyone else wants to know, how can we access those? But maybe you could also tell us some of the myths around potential, and tell us about potential. Such a sticky topic for all the right reasons.
Thank you. It's one of those things where you've had this experience, I'm sure, many times, where you start thinking and talking about a topic and you realize it's been your whole life, but you didn't see it until then. And I feel that way about potential. I think that I've been passionate about helping people achieve their potential as long as I can remember. I think every goal I've ever set has been about stretching my potential in one way or another, or at least realizing it. And what I've become so struck by as I've studied this topic is we all have hidden potential, but we don't know how to unlock it. So why do we often underestimate our own potential? We judge ourselves by our starting abilities. And this is more common for people with fixed mindsets, but even people with growth mindsets. You try a new skill, it doesn't go well, and you think, this is not for me. I'm not cut out for this. And then it gets worse when other people also, you're not just underestimating yourself, you're also being underestimated by others. Other people watch you and say, yeah, you don't have you're not a prodigy. You're not a natural. You don't have the talent that it takes. And I think the big myth there is that raw talent is the most important driver of how high people climb. It's not. Motivation and opportunity matter more than raw ability for growth.
Motivation and opportunity.
Yeah. Obviously, everybody starts at a different point. But how close you come to your potential is much more about the character skills you cultivate to to improve it, improving over time. And then whether you're in a situation where you have access to the knowledge that you need and the tools you need to keep growing. And so, a concrete example of this for me is when I started diving, I was way too late. I picked it up as a teenager. A lot of the elite divers in the world start by 5.
Goodness.
And actually, in China, they're handpicked for body type and sent to a version of diving boarding school where they don't even teach kids how to swim. They tie a rope around them so that they can just pull them back after they hit the water in the deep end.
What part of their body they tie a rope around?
I think it's their waist.
So they're diving with a rope so that when they get in the water, they're not wasting any energy.
Exactly.
They're just being dragged through the water and out.
That's my understanding of it.
Wow. But presumably, okay, they have to walk, they have to climb.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are a bunch of other things they have to do.
Yeah, but the swimming apparently is very secondary. Anyway, so I started really late, and I lacked most of the things that you would want as a diver. I couldn't touch my toes without bending my knees. My teammates called me Frankenstein because I was so stiff when I walked. So lacking the flexibility, I have no rhythm. My coach brought a metronome to practice one day, and I couldn't even keep the beat. So, you think about diving as a sport of grace. Nope. And then I also couldn't jump, and I couldn't twist either. And so it's like you're missing the explosive power. You don't have the athleticism. And I think if I had just looked at those abilities, I had no business being a diver. And in fact, no business being an athlete. I'd already been cut from the middle school basketball team 3 times. I didn't make the high school soccer team. Those were the 2 sports I had poured a decade into. This is going nowhere. Eric, just the most incredible coach I could ever imagine. He said to me on the first day of practice, he said, yes, you're missing all these things, but I believe if you pour yourself into this sport, that you could be a state finalist by the time you finish high school. And he saw more potential in me than I saw in myself, and that just lit a fire under me. And what that translated into is a lot of the behaviors that you and I both studied. Setting specific difficult goals for I want to learn these dives that seem out of reach. I want to increase my score over the next 3 meets by 10 points. I want to learn how to, all my limitations notwithstanding, one thing that I can master that I have total control over is how clean I go into the water. I can get a rip entry so that there's no splash, and that's the most important part of a dive. And one of the greatest compliments I ever got as a diver was I came out of a meet in, it was a couple years in, I think I was maybe a junior in high school. And one of the judges turned to Eric and said, all he can do is rip. And Eric said, so? I was like, yes!
It's awesome. It's almost like saying all he can do is win,
It was a great backhanded compliment, but Eric was like, listen, he made the dive. It has a degree of difficulty. Maybe he didn't jump as high as he wanted. Maybe his tuck wasn't as tight as he wanted. But at the end of the day, that dive disappeared straight up and down into the water. You can't not give that a 7. And that ended up serving me really well. And so I think the broader lesson here for me was Eric said to me, actually last year, I never thought about this. He said, I never got close to even qualifying for Olympic trials. I did not have the talent to be that good, but I got way better than I ever expected. And Eric said to me, he said, looking back, he said, you got further with less talent than any diver I've ever coached. And that was so meaningful to me. And what it reminded me was my proudest accomplishments were not in the areas where I started out with the most talent. They were in the areas where I had overcome the most obstacles. And I think that to me is really what drives people around potential, is to say, it's not performance that's motivating, it's a sense of progress.
I love that story, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think, Lord knows, my favorite topic in science is the course I performed, at least after my freshman year, which was abysmal, least well in the phase when I was doing well.
What class was it?
Neural development. I now teach neural development.
I'm sorry, what?
Neural development.
How bad were you at it at first?
Okay, well, I have to put it in context. My high school and freshman year of college were abysmal, right? I basically no place being there. I can only thank my high school girlfriend for being so wonderful that I followed her off to college and ended up there. Left after my freshman year, came back, and then at that point it was like a step function. I worked out of fear and excitement and love of the material. I was a straight A student thereafter. But in my senior year, I took a course in neural development, which was extremely challenging, and I got a B+. And that B+ still gets me, but it's a topic that I love the most. It's what I did my graduate thesis on. It's what I teach at Stanford, among other topics. And I like to think now I have, I guess, humility aside, considerable mastery over the material. But it's because I didn't do as well as I would have liked, and I applied myself so much. And I think that it just didn't come naturally to me. And then eventually, over time, you kind of get it, or you get it. So but it's still my favorite topic because it was that friction point, right? It's the ratcheting through. And there's something, I don't know, that's just so intrinsically satisfying to me. I used to watch my bulldog Mastiff Costello like chewing on a bone, or when he was on a brick, because he had a kind of a Homer Simpson brain about his object choice to chew on, and he just looked like he was in just total bliss. It was like this effort combined with some intrinsic pleasure of the process. And so I think that when one is ratcheting through something that's hard, it feels so good that it's almost better than the outcome. Like it is better than the outcome.
I think it is. And, it's fascinating because this is why I'm always bothered by people saying play to your strengths. Because if you do that, you will gravitate toward the things that come naturally to you. And you're going to miss out on very often the skill that was hard for you to learn, to your point, is one that you end up with greater mastery over because you had to put in the extra effort. And you end up deriving more satisfaction out of the fact that, this was really tough and I figured it out. Implicit in your story, and maybe partially explicit in some parts, when I was looking at the character skills that help people realize their potential and really fuel unexpected growth, I ended up finding 3 that I think are under-discussed and well supported by science. I think that basically, if you want to reach your potential or achieve more than you think you're capable of, we're looking at becoming a creature of discomfort and embracing things that are unpleasant or awkward for you. That would be the first thing. The second is being a sponge and soaking up new information and also filtering out what might not be useful. And then the third is being an imperfectionist, which is knowing when to aim for excellence and when to settle for good. And I hear all of those themes in your story. That was obviously uncomfortable. You got a B+. You don't want to do any more neural development.
No,
not at all.
It was so frustrating and so exciting to me at the same time. And then everything I did in the 5 or 7 years that followed was all about learning more about this topic and it wasn't about performing well or proving myself. I love the material so much more because of how challenging it was. And I'm grateful to you, Ben Reese, the professor at UC Santa Barbara, incredible neuroanatomist and teacher of neural development and laboratory scientist, because I think had I gotten an A, I don't know that I would have fallen in love with it in the same way. Isn't that weird?
You wouldn't have had to work at it to discover what was fun about it, I imagine.
No, absolutely. And it's still one of my favorite topics to teach and learn about. So you mentioned discomfort, being a sponge/filter, if I got that right,
yep.
And an imperfectionist. Tell me more about the imperfectionist piece, because I feel like I've had students in my lab and I've known people in other domains of life that they're absolutely paranoid about shipping something out for the world to see it. And of course, no one wants to put stuff out into the world that isn't right and God forbid could be wrong, but or that's going to embarrass us. So you can understand why people are perfectionists, but I never really understood the extreme perfectionists. How do they ever do anything? And are they happy people? Because I can't imagine that they are.
No, I mean, so Thomas Curran, I think, is the world's leading psychologist studying perfectionism. And if you look at his meta-analyses, perfectionism is a recipe for burnout and depression and anxiety, because you're constantly comparing yourself to an ideal that's unachievable. Perfectionists they do get better grades in school slightly, but they don't do any better at work than their peers, because I think in school you have a predictable outcome. You have a general sense of what's going to be on a test, and if you study hard enough, you can come closer to the A+. Whereas at work, performance is much more nebulous. And so what happens to perfectionists a lot of times is they end up optimizing the things that are predictable and controllable, and then sort of missing the forest and the trees. And I think the antidotes, as far as I know, really have to do with calibration. So, I talked earlier about how I like to ask for a 0 to 10 to find out, am I in the ballpark or not? Well, one of my biggest liabilities as a diver was I was never satisfied with my score. And one day Eric said to me, you hear Olympic judges talk about, or commentators talk about the perfect 10. That's a misnomer. If you look at the diving rule book, a 10 is for excellence, not for perfection. There's no such thing as a flawless dive. I can look at dives that have gotten straight 10s and point out 19 things that were wrong with them, but they were excellent. And so then we had to define the standards of excellence. So what I have, as a recovering perfectionist, somebody who, just beat myself up constantly. In fact, we did paper plate awards on my swim team. And one year I was given the If Only award. And there's a little cartoon of me and it says, if only I had pointed my left pinky toe, I would have gotten an 8.5 instead of an 8. And that was like the story of my diving career. And I did not want to be that person anymore. And so one of the things I've learned to do is to, when I start anything, if I sit down to write a book, I'm aiming for a 9. And the reason for that is I'm going to pour a couple years of, my work life into this topic. Hopefully a lot of people are going to read it, and I want to make sure it's truly the best work I can produce. Social media posts, I'm okay with a 7. Like, if I'm only shooting for a 9, I'm not going to post very often.
Because your ceiling for 9 or your threshold for 9 is so exceedingly
high.
Yeah.
And I want it to keep getting higher over time. So my idea of a 9 today is much more challenging than it was 10 years ago. And I think this is what people probably don't do enough, especially if you're an extreme perfectionist, is they don't realize, okay, let me figure out how important this task is. And then for this task, a 6 is sufficient. So that then I can pour my energy into pulling the 7.5 toward a 9 where it really matters. And inevitably, if you don't do that, what you will do is you will get a bunch of 9s on things that are completely trivial.
I went to a high school where we had a couple kids get perfect on the SAT. They would have the big centerfold list of all the early admissions to all the fancy Ivy League schools. I definitely was not on that list. I don't even know if I was anywhere near that list. Probably not. And some of them have gone on to have terrific lives and seem pretty happy. And I know a number of them and I'm in contact with them. And I think for some of them that performed exceedingly well on standardized tests early on, I hear a bit more dismay in their current life. Not all, but is there? I have to imagine there are data on sort of early high performance being a seed for challenges later on. Obviously, you don't want the opposite. The sort of what I guess they refer to now as the complete failure to launch. People not meeting the milestones toward being self-sufficient adults. But what are some of the dangers of success when thinking about realizing one's larger potential?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I think the data on this go both ways. So, some early success is, it's a motivator. It builds the kind of momentum you were talking about earlier. There's goal-setting researchers like Locke and Latham have talked about the high performance cycle, where you hit a goal, and then that builds your confidence, and then you set a more ambitious goal, and then you reach it, and there's this upward spiral over time. But there's also a mountain of evidence that achieving your goals can make you complacent. And there's sometimes it's called the fat cat syndrome, where you end up resting on your laurels. And then there are also competency traps, where you get good at something and then you keep doing it the way you've always done it, and you don't realize the world has changed around you. Like I'm allergic to the idea of best practices. Like the moment you call a practice best, you've created an illusion that you're done. And the moment, think about pre-COVID, a lot of companies had really, what they thought were effective models for collaboration. And all of a sudden, their best practices are not feasible because everybody's working remotely. And they've got to throw that out the window and look for better practices for an evolved world. So I think those are the things I worry about most with early success. I think that one of the things I would love to see more people do when it comes to reaching potential is to figure out, what does my failure budget look like? So I'll tell you my experience on this. It started, I wrote a first book, gave a TED Talk, and pretty soon felt like I was spending 80% of my time saying things I already knew. And I was getting typecast. I'm I'm like, I'm not learning and growing, but I'm also not, I don't feel like I'm contributing new knowledge to the world. What am I going to do about that? And 2018 rolls around and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to start a podcast and that will be my learning mechanism. And I didn't know if it was going to work. I didn't know how the medium would work for me. I didn't know if people were going to want to listen to my voice. I certainly don't. Maybe Morgan Freeman likes the sound of his own voice.
I like listening to your podcast.
Thank you. I also enjoy listening to yours, but I think everybody hates the sound of their voice. I just wasn't sure for a lot of reasons whether it was going to work. And then I thought about it and I realized, well, all of the pivotal moments in my career have come from taking a risk. And I thought that I needed to build the confidence in order to do it. And I was reflecting on goal setting research as one does, and realized, like the confidence is going to come through doing it. And so let me try it. And I guess what I took away was if I never fail, it means I'm not challenging myself. I'm not embracing discomfort. I'm not being enough of an imperfectionist. So I actually set a goal that I would start at least one project every year that didn't succeed. And let's be clear, I'm not aiming for failure. What I'm doing is creating an acceptable zone of failure to know that that's going to motivate some risk taking and some experimentation and hopefully some growth. And I know it's hard for a lot of people to do this in their lives, especially if you have a super demanding boss. But I think we're all better off from a growth and potential standpoint if we've got, if you succeed on 90% of your projects, that should be a hugely successful year. If you succeed on 100%, I think you're aiming too low.
What are some of the projects that you are currently spinning in the back of your mind that would be fun, but if you're willing to share, that for you still strike a little bit of an anxiety chord? Like, oh no, like are you? I don't know. Are you a musician? Do you
Not at all.
All right,
Can't carry a tune.
Okay.
Can't keep a beat.
Are you thinking about becoming a musician or exploring playing music? I mean, the reason I ask it that way is how far into your discomfort zone do you reach in order to challenge yourself? Because I think that everyone needs to have thresholds. Like there are a lot of things that I wish I could play a musical instrument, frankly, but I'm not that motivated to do it. Mostly because I enjoy hearing other people play music so much that I'm perfectly happy. I'm sated.
Yeah, there's also enough good music out there. You don't have to create it.
There's definitely a lot of great music. Yeah.
So I think there's a micro and a macro version of this. So on the micro side, in the past year, I did this work-life podcast for 5 years where I was taking the core of my organizational psychology work and trying to take on a topic and make it interesting and useful to people. And then realizing I was feeling constrained just to focus on work. And as a psychologist, there's lots of other things I want to take on. And so we expanded into this second show, Rethinking. And I have some experiments I'm tempted to try, but I've been really hesitant to do them. So did you watch wrestling growing up ever? Professional
wrestling? Yeah. I did watch a little bit of it. And then for whatever reason, in the last year, my good friend Rick Rubin, he's like not obsessed, but he is a real devotee. He's a fan of professional wrestling. He had me watch some WWE, but even AEW. He was explaining that it's basically physical drama. He's explaining why it's so intriguing to him and so informative to him. And then I'm a big fan of certain genre of music, and Lars Fredrickson from Rancid is a huge wrestling fan. So now I've got multiple people that I've come into contact with who are like telling me all this stuff about wrestling. So wrestling seems to be cropping up more and more.
All right, so I don't know the first thing about wrestling. I think I caught it a few times as a kid.
Likewise, Hulk Hogan and a few others passed across
Macho
the
Man.
screen. Yeah.
Yep. But the thing that I remember was loving the tag team matches where somebody would get overpowered and then they pull in somebody to help. I think it would be so interesting if there was a podcast where you take issues that people fundamentally disagree on and you start a debate, and then somebody can tag in if they want to challenge an argument. And so instead of concentrating on the particular guests, you basically have a problem you're trying to get to the roots of, and you're going to have all these people jump in and hopefully build toward a more insightful perspective on it. I have no idea if this is going to work. I'd really love to try it. And this is the first time I've spoken out loud about it, because I'm like, I don't know that I want to see that crash and burn. And yet, like, why not? Like, what's the risk?
I think it's so cool.
It'd be fun, right?
Yeah. What topics are you thinking about covering? Because I can think of some pretty controversial topics, but I want to know what the ones you're thinking about.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking out loud here, but one that I think on the controversial front that could be really rich is to think about policies for trans athletes in sports.
That's a controversial topic.
Hugely controversial, but also I've talked to some experts on this. I've talked to some trans athletes, and the people who are deep in this do not know what they think the policy should be. And so I think actually hearing them talk and, understanding the complexity of those issues, and then, maybe hammering out like what's a policy you would propose for schools, what would you want for Olympic events. I just think that would be fascinating, and I'd love to moderate that discussion.
Oh, goodness,
maybe I wouldn't.
I wouldn't.
Like, I don't want to wade into that one.
I'm glad you would. I wouldn't. That seems like one of the most barbed wire topics one could ever embark on, which is exactly why I'm going to put in my vote. You absolutely should do this podcast. I think it's an amazing idea. Actually, folks, put in the comment section on YouTube whether or not Adam should do this podcast and that topic in particular. I think it would be amazing because one thing that I keep coming back to in my own mind is that a lot of the controversies out there stem from the fact that we very often have individuals pitted against individuals.
Yes.
And there's so much lost in that. And I think about science and going back to the scientific method where we have subfields pitted against subfields when you talk about a field. Like there was huge controversy over the structure of DNA, and it wasn't one individual against another. What you had are small groups, different camps, and there was some partial overlap. There's also, if you read the double helix, there was also a lot of complicated behavior. People entering romantic relationships just to glean information from the other side. Human beings not at their finest. But in any event, small panels arguing, competing, teams competing, I think is far more interesting and informative than individuals, butting heads.
I think so too, and I think another one that I think would be really interesting. I mean, I'm like, people always say great minds think alike. No, great minds challenge each other to think differently, and we just don't do enough of that. So I've been thinking a lot politically. Like, what if we brought together a bunch of people who are not ideologues, but are really interested in pragmatic policy solutions to rewrite the Constitution, if we were going to build one today?
You'd like to tackle big stuff.
I
love it. Like, I love it. It's a compliment. It's a compliment.
Well, thank you. No, but I mean, what are the odds that...
Like I said earlier, no weak sauce. No weak sauce. Like you just, you go right for it. I mean, these are the issues that people are really activated by because these are really core issues. They get down to the autonomic nervous system. They're in the hypothalamus, as we say.
But I don't think they should be. Like, I look at these topics and think, I just want to get it right. Like, I don't have a vested interest in what the model should be. I just know that even the wisest people of 250 years ago were not prepared to anticipate the world we live in today. And we ought to be constantly, I don't know, I don't think you should live in a world where you affirm your beliefs. I think the only way you learn is by continually evolving your beliefs. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out more ways to catalyze that around issues people care about. But I don't care about the issues. I care about the stretching of thinking and the improving the way that the world works.
Well, I'll tell you, if you decide to do this podcast with a tag team format, I love that you gleaned it from watching wrestling a couple of times around these very controversial issues. I promise you that will be one of the most popular and important podcasts on the planet Earth. There might be podcasts on other planets. I hear that they're galaxies far, far away. They may have podcasts too, may have had them for much longer than we have, but that's a winner. Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll try it as a little experiment on the Rethinking feed and see if it's an unmitigated disaster.
Well, you know where my vote lies.
I appreciate that. So to go back to your question for a second, on the macro side, I've always thought it would be fun to try to write a sci-fi novel. And the question I'm wrestling with right now is that a good use of my time? Like, there are great sci-fi writers out there. There aren't that many social scientists communicating about the topics that I do. And it feels like it might be, I don't know, like this it might be too much of a diversion.
Then again, according to your words, you had no talent in diving, but you exceeded all performance metrics. by a considerable amount through motivation and opportunity. I got that right. I vote yes. I haven't read much sci-fi. Maybe I need to read more sci-fi. Are you a fan of sci-fi?
I love sci-fi. Okay. It's one of my favorite ways to imagine a better world and also, prevent a worse one from emerging. But I don't know. There's a part of me that thinks, all right, there's Ruth Bernstein and colleagues did this. Do you know this research on Nobel Prize winning scientists and what differentiates them from their peers?
No, but being the son of a physicist and having been surrounded by circumstance, a number of Nobel Prize winners when I was a young kid, I'm very curious to know what this research says.
I mean, there are many themes you could glean from it, but the thing that really jumped out at me is the Nobel Prize winners are more likely to have artistic hobbies.
Feynman certainly did.
Yep. I mean, there's a long list of them, but if you break it down in the data, it was they're twice as likely as their peers to play a musical instrument. They're 7 times as likely to draw or paint. They're 12 times as likely to do poetry or fiction, creative writing. And get this, 22 times as likely as their peers, 22, to dance, act, or perform as magicians. As a former magician, I was very excited by this.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't going to ask about magic, but let's talk about it. I was on vacation every year I take my sister to New York for her birthday and my birthday because our birthdays are close together. And we went and saw a magician mentalist by the name of Ossie Wind. Ozzy, I think is the correct pronunciation, who just like the last time I saw him, absolutely blew my mind. There's no way it's not magic. Of course, I know it's not magic, but it's but my understanding is that there's some things that he and other great mentalists and magicians do where they are not absolutely certain of the outcome. They're playing, it's probabilistic. And so there's a risk and a thrill for them too. And that they're also creating memories and erasing memories. And that's something that I may host Ossie on the podcast because
that would be fun.
He's very effective at creating memories and erasing memories. That's a lot of what he does. And he has tactics to do that. In any event, I wasn't going to ask about magic, but I know that you were a professional magician at one point in your life, and that you did this presumably because you enjoy doing it. But getting beyond the sort of pull the rabbit out of the hat or pick or identify the card that the person picked out of the shuffled stack, what is it and what was it about magic that intrigues you? Does it inform anything about the work that you do now?
It does, yeah. I think when I started, I was 12, and it was just fun, and I was looking for a way to entertain other people and entertain myself in the process. And then, it became a challenge. Can I learn this new skill, and can I master this trick? I think nerdiest thing I did in college was I started a magic club with David Kwong, who is a stellar magician and cruciverbalist, as he calls it.
Cruciverbalist.
He does magic crossword puzzles, essentially, that I can't do it justice. You have to see it. It's unreal. And I watched him for, our first performance together and realized one of us is going to make it as a magician, and it's not me. He's outstanding. Anyway, the way it figures into my work now is I think so much of good science communication is misdirection. And it's the same skill I use as a magician. If I told you that the card you picked was about to disappear from the deck and appear on the window, you would not be nearly as intrigued as if it happened by surprise. And I think the same is true when we communicate knowledge. I think it's actually why so many of my posts, you flagged this earlier, so many of my posts start with, this thing is not what you think. It's actually this other thing. I think that, challenging conventional wisdom, questioning assumptions is what surprises people, and then leads them to think either I have something to learn, or, oh no, I got to put up a shield because my beliefs are being challenged or attacked. And I think the art form of magic was always about creating a surprise that would delight people, as opposed to leading people to feel like they were tricked or duped or manipulated. And so I think the challenge for me is to say, okay, I want to figure out what do we know from behavioral science, mostly focusing on psychology because that's my core expertise. What do we know that's actually different from most intuition? And then how do I explain that in a way that surprises people but leads them to say, oh, that's so interesting, as opposed to that's wrong, and then want to fight about it.
It's almost as if you give them the experience of what you're trying to teach them so that that's wrong can't be the available response.
Yes.
It because in magic, it's everyone knows it's magic, just like with professional wrestling folks, by the way. There's some prior understanding of what's going to happen. Maybe they go off script, but I think that's actually, part of the interest in professional wrestling for those that are extreme fans of professional wrestling is that they almost want to wonder about whether or not some of it is not in the plan. Like it's a suspension of reality that they seem to enjoy, right? Because if you know something's fake, I should be more careful about my language. With magic, like when I went to see Ozzy, I don't think it's actual magic, but he's able to give the illusion of magic. The real illusion is that it's magic, right? It's not the illusion of making the card hop to somewhere else in the room. And he is phenomenal, and I highly recommend people go see his show if they get the opportunity. But I think they're doing a documentary about him now. Actually, there'll be some Netflix stuff as well.
Wait.
But it's the illusion that magic exists that's so exciting. So with science communication, I always aim for 4 things. I don't always achieve them, and I think you do as well, if I may, that a topic be interesting, clear, ideally actionable, but not always. And the quadfecta is when it's also surprising. So interesting, clear, actionable, and surprising sort of is the ultimate if there's sort of I didn't realize that. But it's hard to find data points that satisfy all 4 criteria.
Yes, and the surprising is the least important, by far. I assume table stakes it's rigorous.
Oh, well, okay, sitting underneath all 4 of those points are that it's actual science, right? Someone didn't just say it, right? It's not conjecture or theory. So that means that there's data to support it and that the data were collected with the appropriate amount of rigor, right? So there's a reservoir of stuff that sits underneath that as a foundation.
Yes, so given the baseline of rigor, how do I find what's interesting, clear, actionable, and hopefully surprising? Although I would make a case. There's a classic article that Murray Davis wrote, one of my all-time favorites. He was a sociologist who wrote a paper called That's Interesting. And he opened the paper by saying, ideas live not because they're true, but because they're interesting, which decimated one of my core beliefs. I thought it was accuracy that drove people's beliefs. And he said, no, ideas live because they're interesting. And then he goes to build an index of the interesting to explain when people are intrigued. And his case is that most of interest is surprise. And he breaks down all the ways that you can turn conventional wisdom upside down. You can say that something you thought was bad was actually good, or vice versa. You can argue that something you thought was homogeneous is actually heterogeneous. You could argue that something you thought was individual was actually a collective phenomenon, or vice versa. And he's got this wonderful breakdown of all the ways of being interesting. And he's the one who made the distinction between ideas that challenge weakly held assumptions, intriguing you, and strongly held assumptions, sort of offending you. But I think from Davis's view, and I think he's right, a huge amount of interest is surprise. And so, but I don't think it's the only driver of interest. So I might take your criteria and say, okay, we start with rigor. We want to go to interest, clarity, and actionability. How do we get to interest? Let's build a submodel of the factors that drive interest, and surprise might have the biggest beta weight in the regression equation. But what else? What else drives interest? I have a couple hypotheses. I want to hear yours. You've been doing this actively and highly effectively. Beyond surprise, what else interests people in your content?
Anything that draws on self-reflection for them.
Boom.
I think we all have an innate desire to better understand ourselves, why we work the way we do, why we don't work as well as we would like to in certain domains, like and cast understanding on our experiences of others too. Like, oh, now it makes sense. Like I'm going back to the Conti episodes, but we did several of them, so I think it's appropriate, to learn from him that narcissism is envy. It represents a extreme deficiency in the pleasure that narcissists can have an extreme pleasure drive, but they always feel like they have far less than they would like to have, and that others have far more of it because they don't have that same yearning for it, right? And so that narcissism at its core is deep envy. That to me was like, wow, and to realize that and to now understand that all this discussion that you hear out there about narcissists, everyone calling other people narcissists, that there are genuine narcissists out there, and what they really suffer from is an extreme deficit in pleasure, and they're constantly envious of others. It reframed everything I thought about narcissists, about them being overbearing, which they can be and often are, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's also anything that leads to I can navigate narcissists better with that.
Well, that checks all your boxes.
Right.
It's very surprising because it's not the way we normally understand narcissism. But I think you hit on, for me, it's at least as important as surprise, maybe more so, is self-relevance. And it doesn't have to be actionable, right? It has to, in a lot of cases, just help you understand or make sense of something that's been puzzling or that's sort of. I think I'm almost always surprised when I say something from, here's a synthesis of research, here's a meta-analysis, and I think it's kind of obvious, and people get excited about it because it gave them language to describe something they had felt, but they didn't know how to articulate or talk about. And I think this is why most of the most popular TED Talks are about human behavior, because people are interested in people. And if you learn something about you or about others, you don't have to immediately do anything with that to find it intriguing and even useful, because it enriched your worldview.
A recent guest on this podcast, we haven't aired it yet, but maybe it'll be out by the time this airs, was with Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's a
psychologist turned neuroscientist.
Yeah, right, studies emotion.
Emotion, of course.
Yeah, and she described how in certain cultures there's a language for subcategories of emotions.
Emotional granularity.
Right. So, she described a word in Japanese, I don't recall what the word was, that describes the feeling of sadness that one has after getting a particularly bad haircut. Something that I don't think you or I are familiar with, but I'm familiar with from my experience of romantic partners being like really unhappy about their haircut. And you're sad, but by having a specific word for a specific experience, people feel less alone, and the feeling passes more quickly in time. And then she gave some other examples from German and from Scandinavian languages and so forth. And I find this so interesting. It's like, the moment people hear that they are not alone in an experience, there's nothing actionable about it, but it creates a cognitive shift thereafter in which they suffer less, or maybe feel more connected to others. I think it's really a beautiful example of exactly what you're referring to. Like when we learn about something and we identify with it, it's powerful.
It's very powerful. And I think psychologists often say, name it to tame it. Affect labeling is one of the most effective emotion regulation strategies. And when we talked about distraction and reframing earlier, I should have said there's a third strategy, which is literally just to describe what you're feeling. It seems to allow people then to reason with and process whatever they're feeling, as opposed to allowing the feeling to control them. And I probably got the clearest sense of this in 2021. I wrote a New York Times article on languishing, the feeling of meh or blah. And I have never had any article I wrote resonate like this. And it just, all the posts that tagged me were just like, it me, it us. And it was like these 1 and 2 word reactions. And I don't think it was the content that mattered to people. It was just having the term. All of a sudden, people realized, this is originally Corey Keyes' research that I was referencing. It had been a light bulb for me to say, if you think about the spectrum of well-being, this is related to your mental illness versus mental health distinction. Those are 2 extremes of the continuum. And on one end, we have depression and burnout. On another end, we have well-being and flourishing. Languishing lives right in the middle. As Corey describes it, it's the absence of well-being. So you're not depressed, you still have hope. You're not burned out, you still have energy. But you're not at peak functioning. You're missing a sense of purpose. You feel like you're stagnating and you're empty. And there was something about just saying the word languishing that led people to realize, yeah, that's a thing. And of course we're languishing. We're standing still in the middle of a global experiment that no one opted into, which violates all rules of consent by science last time I checked. But I think that's something that probably is underrepresented when we're trained to communicate as scientists. To say one of the most valuable things we do is we give people language to talk about things. And I think that's a massive part of your impact is, this is one of the big things I've learned from you, Andrew, is I used to be a little bit dismissive of cognitive neuroscience in particular. I thought understanding the brain has not taught me that much about the mind. Like being able to, trace. Let's take a simple example. Like when I read Joe Ledoux's research, being able to trace, certain amygdala responses, as the root of how people deal with fight or flight and threat. I'm like, I don't know that helped me that much. Like if I could just describe fight or flight, do I need the amygdala? And you've convinced me I was wrong about that, because when they understand the neurological substrates of their thoughts, feelings, and actions, they believe them more. They're like, oh, like there is a mechanism for this. It's being produced inside my head. And even though I can't see it, it's there and it can be studied with the tools of science. I think that's a really big deal.